Today we are back on the right-hand drive Supra build, and today is going to be a massive update and exciting video for this build because, as you can see, I'm walking towards it. We got the engine block back from the machine shop, and this thing is a beauty. We had it decked, bored 20 over, checked for cracks, all the stuff you normally do, check all the clearances for the mains and the rods since we are using ARP hardware. We had the crank polished, just all the things, and it is looking absolutely beautiful. So what we're going to be installing today, of course, is the crankshaft, which is behind me, but we also have our Wiseco pistons and our MaXPeedingRods. The machine shop did check these rods out very carefully, and they were very impressed at the quality of the rods. These are using the ARP 2000 hardware, and we do have our ARP main bolts as well, or main studs rather. And then we have our ACL rod bearings, ACL main bearings, ACL thrust washers, and all the lubricants we're gonna need to help us assemble this engine. The ARP assembly lube here, that's for getting the proper torque on your fasteners. I'm gonna try out this driven assembly lube that I see a lot of guys using, and then we have ATF for the cylinder walls. So it's time to start putting this thing together. Let's get to it. If you guys have been following this build, you know that this is a spare 2JZ block that I had for the Supra, and this thing was super dirty, just covered in filth and grime and grease and oil and just anything that you could possibly think of. It was just a really dirty block. And I've sent a lot of engines off to the machine shop in the past. I have never ever received one back this clean. Normally there is some grime left on it, but whatever mix that this machine shop is using, it's amazing. I mean, it's just like you could eat off of this thing. So huge thanks to Import Engine Supply out here in Boise, Idaho for the work they did on this engine. One of the first things that I like to do is just start blowing out all of the orifices and the bolt holes and all of the threads and whatnot with compressed air, get everything really nice and clean before I start working on it, and then we'll start with getting the crank installed. Something really important to note when you're tearing apart an engine or anything that's very delicate is to make sure that you remember the direction and the location of certain items. So when I'm taking off these main caps, they are marked, but I'm still placing them down in a way where I remember what forward is and where they were in the engine block. I have the main caps and the ARP studs removed, and one thing that you have to know is, like everything in an engine, these are ordered. They go in a specific way, and luckily for us, these are marked. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They're marked from the factory. Not sure if you can see that right there. That one says 6, this one says 5. You can see that these have to go back in a particular way. So what I'm gonna do before I get the crankshaft installed, I'm gonna go totally OCD with cleaning on this thing. You have to be really clean when you're building an engine. So what I wanna do, and I'm sure the machine shop has already done this, but I'm gonna do it anyway. You can tell how clean everything is here. I'm gonna clean out all these journals just like I did for the cylinder walls, and I'm going to blow out each one of these bolt holes with brake cleaner and compressed air, and then I'm gonna chase them too, just to make sure that everything is nice and clean. And at that point, we can get the crankshaft reinstalled. And another thing I'm gonna do is just check the bearing clearances really quickly with Plastigauge. Now, Plastigauge is not the best way to check bearing clearances, but the machine shop has already set the clearance. I just want to verify that it is there with the Plastigauge. You can see the machining marks here on the actual block end where they had to machine some off to get the perfect clearance with those ARP main studs. And what they'll do is a lot of times they'll either cut the cap, which this one does look like it was cut, or they will slightly trim the block side or both, as you can see in my case here. All right, let's get to cleaning. One thing I forgot to mention is I'm going to use my hand to just feel the main caps, the sides of the main caps where everything was cut and trimmed and machined, and just make sure that there's no rough edges, no burrs, nothing that's going to touch a very delicate crankshaft or rod or bearing and cause any potential issues down the line. So that's why I'm not wearing gloves. And remember, you cannot be too clean when it comes to building an engine. You got to be clean. You got to keep everything 100% dust free, grease free, just clean. And that's what we're doing. The reason why these holes have to be cleaned out and chased is because when we install the stud, we have to make sure that all the studs are, relatively tightened or screwed down to the same area. We don't want to compress anything in that bolt hole, especially if it's a fluid, but we don't want anything like marring up the threads inside the block or preventing the stud or the bolt, if we were using bolts, from properly being able to be torqued. So just making sure that everything is clean basically eliminates all of those potential issues and failure points. The threads that go into the block from the stud are the thread side that do not have the Allen key. I believe the Allen key side is called the broached end. And I'm just going to lubricate these with a little bit of oil and then just hand tight them into the block so that they can float. If you really crank the stud into the block, it can actually cockeye the stud and it could mess with your torque values or offset your main cap or do something weird. So make sure that these are hand tight. For installing bearings, I like to do a quick sweep of my thumb in the bearing journal before I put the bearing in. You could use a shop towel for this, and of course that's totally fine. I'm just paranoid that I'm going to either leave a part of the towel behind or do something else, so I just like to use my thumb to just verify nothing's there, pop the bearing in, and then I'm good to go. We are ready to install the crankshaft. It's over there on my toolbox, making me really nervous, like it's gonna roll off. But it's not going to. I just ran out of space on the table here. Please do not roll off of the toolbox. Anyway, I want to show you guys something. I just measured with my Michitoyo Quantum mic my old thrust washers and my new thrust washers, and you can see they are very close to each other. Basically the exact same. This is really important. If you get the thrust wrong, all your hard work is going to mean nothing. That just allows the crank to move forward and backward the minimal amount that it needs to, and the spec is really, really wide. But if the crank can't move, you're going to be dealing with some issues. And on the other hand, if it moves too much, you're going to be dealing with some issues as well. So we have all of the ARP main studs hand tight. That's important because they need to be able to float so they can self-center. So you can see I can wiggle this like a loose tooth. That's what we want. We have all of the main bearings in the engine, and you can see that we have the side that has the oil holes going towards the block, which is the way that it should be. And then lastly, a lot of guys just rotate these. Oh, there it goes. A lot of guys rotate the thrust washers into place after they have the crankshaft installed. I like to glue mine there with some assembly lube and just I'll check them in a very OCD way once I get the crankshaft in there, but they're in place. And that's actually the way that the manual shows it too. So at this point, we're ready to drop the crankshaft in. We're gonna lube up these main bearings, and then we're gonna not lube the caps because I wanna test it with plastic gauge to see the clearance. And whew, out of breath. But the last thing is that the first main cap is slightly larger than the rest. As you can see, the tang is on the other side too, so that you can't get it wrong. So the tang here on that side, every other one, it's there. All right, let's do it. All right, we pulled off all of the main caps and everything is in spec just as we thought, but I'll show you real quick how I'm using this plastic gauge. So you can see here that we have thousandths of an inch right there, if the camera would decide to focus. Let me make this focus for you. That's about as good as it's going to get. So you can see we have 1,000th, 1.5 thousandths, 2 thousandths, and 3 thousandths. And when we tore this thing apart, it was at 1.5 thousandths, and that's what the machine shop said it was at now. Of course, as I already said, plastic gauge is not the best way to do this, but it will, just verify this and give us some peace of mind somewhat before putting it back together. You would typically want to use a caliper and a dial bore gauge, a micrometer and a dial bore gauge, but since the machine shop set the clearance already, we don't need to worry about it. So you can see that matches up right there to the 1.5 thousandths mark, and it is that way for every single crank journal. So let's toss this thing back together with some lubricant on the caps, and we'll be done with the crank. One of the things that I try not to do when I'm putting assembly lube on is get it onto that mating surface where the main cap will tighten down to the block. Now, I don't even know if this makes a difference, but I just don't want anything in between those two areas because I don't want to affect the clamping force or torque values or anything else that might be affected by trying to squeeze out a fluid in between the cap and the block. And another thing that I want to talk about when it comes to torquing down bolts or studs or anything is you really want to pull them through in one nice fluid motion. So if you're supposed to take 3 equal steps up to 60 foot-pounds, for example, on these main studs, you don't want to try to go from like 58 foot-pounds to 60. It'd be much better to go from 30 to 60 in one nice pull. Well, as you guys can see, the crankshaft is in, but I also got 5 of the 6 pistons installed. I saved the very last one, which is cylinder 3, to show you guys on camera. When it comes to building engines, I just really need to focus. I can't be filming the whole time, so I just did everything else except for that last piston, which I will show you guys in excruciating detail right now. So we're going to be going over how to set up and file the rings, the direction that they have to go, which way they face, up or down, basically everything to get the piston installed. And then we're going to go and check the rod bearing clearance and then set up the stretch of the rod bolt. So let's get to it. I was pleasantly surprised at the quality of these rods, if I'm being honest. And the machine shop they didn't have anything negative to say about them either. These things weighed within a gram of each other, most of them within half a gram of each other. They spec'd out well for bearing clearances. They didn't have any issues with wrist pin clearance. They come with ARP fasteners, and I verified with ARP. I sent them an email and they told me, yes, we do make rod bolts for MaXPeedingRods. They have a TUV certification, which proves the alloy used in the rod. So, overall, this looks exactly like an Eagle rod to me. I've used those before in the past as well, and I think it's going to work out just fine. They look like a really good unit. So when it comes to piston rings, you're going to have an oil expander ring, 2 oil rail rings, and 2 compression rings. One of the things that I like to do if your oil ring expander doesn't already come this way is get a paint pen and mark the edges of it just so you can make sure that it doesn't overlap itself. You want the ends butted up together, not overlapping. And if they're colored, it's a lot easier to see that. And some piston manufacturers, they do come this way. And then another thing is to make sure that your bearing caps on your rods stay with the rod that they're with. They are machined to that rod. Typically there are some numbers that are like laser etched on the rod cap, but make sure that you put a paint mark or something on there too, just to make sure that they don't get mixed and matched around. Now we need to start checking the clearances of our piston rings. So we're going to start with the oil rings, and I believe Wiseco recommended 15 thousandths minimum for these rings. So I'm just going to use an old piston to push it down into the bore, check it with the feeler gauge, and then toss those onto the pistons. And these ones aren't directional, so they can just be installed right over that expander ring. With the oil rings complete, we can now move on to the second compression ring. And the way you would identify this one is they're typically more brittle than the top ring. They're dull gray, dark gray, or sometimes black in color. They have a bevel on the bottom of them, and I believe that's pronounced Napier. They're a Napier ring. They actually scrape oil back down the cylinder. And we're likely going to have to file this one. And there is a spec sheet that Wiseco recommends, but we're just going to stick this down into the bore, check it with the feeler gauge, and file it as necessary to get it to the right size. It's important that you knock off any burrs that are caused from filing the ring, and this typically happens more on the second ring in my experience than the first ring. It typically comes out pretty smooth. Now on this Wiseco chart, we are going to run higher boost on this engine, like 20 to 30 pounds. So I followed their spec sheet, and we're shooting for 25 thousandths on the second ring and 23 thousandths on the top ring. All right, our rings are filed and the piston is ready to install. We did use the Wiseco chart here to determine what we want the ring gap to be. This is going to depend on your piston manufacturer, so make sure you refer to your own clearance specification chart. So we have all of our pistons set at 23 thousandths for the top ring, 25 thousandths for the second ring, and all of our oil rings spec'd just as they should. So when it comes to the placement of the rings, you can see here that we have the oil expander with the tips facing up, which is what Wiseco recommends. And then on the other side, we have them offset for the oil rings. One is gapped here, one is gapped there. And then for the actual compression rings, it wants the top ring facing this way, and it wants the second ring facing this way. So you can see in the diagram here, it shows us how it wants those ring gaps to be set. Also, just a quick tip, if you're using a feeler gauge and you have a caliper or a micrometer, it is worth your time to make sure that your stuff is actually in spec. So currently we have this set up on a 23 thousandths feeler gauge, and we're getting 22.5 thousandths out of that. So pretty close. I'm using this set of feeler gauges instead of this one because this one was off by a lot more than half a thousand. All right, so let's go ahead and get this piston installed. We're going to be using one of these tapered ring compressors, which makes this whole process a hell of a lot easier. You just put the piston in this and push it down instead of having to use the old style that compresses around the piston, and you could damage the rings that way. These are way better. They're 100% worth $50 or whatever they cost. I'll put this in the link in the description of the video. So what we have to do now, and this is really important if you're using ARP rod bolts, is these have a stretch spec. The manual also gives you a torque value, but if you want to get it right, we should use stretch. It's the truth. The torque is kind of just a suggestion. So we have this Proform rod bolt stretch gauge here. I added a spring to it with a washer so that it holds itself up under its own weight, as you can see there. And what we'll do is we'll just zero out the bolt to this gauge. You can see right here, it's at -1 on that gauge. Each bolt's going to be different. If I get the other one, it's not going to be the same. See, this one's a different length entirely. So we'll just cut that difference in our final measurement. For example, if I zero this bolt out, but then the other bolt is showing like 2 on the gauge, and we're going for 5 thousandths, just as an example, we'll get this one to 5, we'll get that one to 7. So we're going to zero this out, put some ARP lube on these bolts, and tighten them up. You could just have 2 of the same gauge here and have one zeroed out for one bolt and one zeroed out for the other, but that's a waste of money in my opinion. You can see that one zeroed out at -6 and one zeroed out at 0. So if I'm going for 5 thousandths, one of them is going to be -1 and one of them is going to be 5. And that's how we're going to do it. And this is the exact reason why we use stretch over torque. The recommended torque value is 45 foot-pounds, and we only got 4 thousandths of stretch when the recommended value is 5.5 to 6 thousandths of stretch. So we're going to have to go up. We could also burnish these bolts in, which just basically means tightening and loosening them a couple of times, and then just pulling to your final torque value and seeing what you get. All right, guys, well, that's gonna wrap it up for this video. The 2JZ bottom end is done. At this point, normally I'd hook this thing up to the engine hoist. I would put it down on a pallet somewhere or some wood, and I would install the rear main seal, because it's much easier when we're at this point than having to take all this off once we have the cylinder head and everything on there. But that's not here yet, so we're just not gonna tackle that in this video. If this was helpful for you guys or you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up. As always, subscribe to the channel if you're not already, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Later.